What's up, YouTube? Welcome back to Simpli-Fly, where we're breaking down the ACS line by line every single day. I'm Garrett, a flight instructor, and today we're starting off with Task A, subcategory 1, or PA.I.A.K1, which really translates to certification requirements, recent flight experience, and record keeping. So we're going to start off with certification requirements. There's 2 regulations that I want you to remember, and there's a few side regulations that you don't really need to memorize, but know what they are, and that way you can reference them if you're asked about them. So if you don't know what I'm talking about when I say regulations, I'm talking about the Federal Aviation Regulations, and you're going to find those in a copy of your FAR-AIM. If you're at a flight school, you'll probably see these laying around, but if not, just look up FAR-AIM. I'll put it on screen and you'll find one of those. You can find them online, you can find them on the App Store, or you can get them in paper. What I personally recommend if you have a smartphone or an iPad is to go on the App Store and get the FAR-AIM on the App Store. It does cost money, but it's worth the cost because you can search terms by the keyword and find regulations that way, which can be really helpful in your check ride. So if you have your FAR-AIM, go ahead and pull it out and follow along if you want to. Highlight these things, put tabs on them. First one that is worth memorizing, 61-103, or your eligibility. Now when you look at these regs, or regulations, we'll call them regs. When you look at these regs, they're full of lawyer speak and lots of extra words that make it hard for you to memorize what it is that you need. So I've broken it down a lot more simply, but you'll still want to take a look at the FAR-AIM for yourself and highlight, tab it out. That way in your check ride you can pull it out and read it if you need to. For 61-103 eligibility, basically we're breaking down what it is you need to be or have to be eligible to get your private pilot license. So you need to be 17 years old, you need to be English proficient. This means reading, speaking, and writing. You need to be able to do all of those. You need to get the endorsement for your written test. So if you don't know, there's a written test that you have to take to get your private pilot license. Your flight school will definitely tell you about it because they'll probably make you finish it before you solo or some criteria like that. Some flight schools even make you take it before your first day. There's a number of different strategies for how to pass that written test. It's not the focus of this video, but I will be making a video on it eventually, so stay tuned for that. So on top of getting the endorsement for your written test, which is basically an endorsement from your instructor saying that he reviewed your home studying or your studying in front of him and said, okay, he's studied good enough to take the test. Once you have that, you just have to go and take the written test and pass it. You need at least a 70%. Next thing you're gonna need to be eligible is an endorsement for the check ride itself. Once you've done all your training, your instructor is gonna say, okay, I think he's ready. Here's my endorsement to take the check ride. That's the second endorsement you need. To get the license itself, obviously, you have to pass the check ride. Seems self-explanatory, but it's in the regulation, right? You need to pass the check ride to actually get the license. And during all of your training, you need to have your student pilot license. In the very beginning, first couple lessons, you might not have it, but in order to be eligible for your check ride, you're gonna have to have that student pilot license. Your next regulation worth memorizing is 61-109. This is your regulation for aeronautical experience, so basically what you have to have done in the air. Even though this is what we have to have done in the air, you're gonna get asked about it in the check ride. The DPE, the person giving you your check ride, is gonna ask to see your logbook where he's gonna want to see this aeronautical experience laid out. So it's best if you have it memorized just in case you get asked about it. So at the absolute minimum, you gotta have 40 hours to get your private pilot license. In reality, you will probably have more hours than that. Most people get it in around 60 to 100 hours, I would say. And that's because these are bare minimum requirements, but there are certain things that might take you extra time to get comfortable with in your training, such as learning how to land or cross-country flight training. Sometimes these things don't just click right away, so you have to spend some extra time training them, and most people do, but there are those few that get their private pilot in around just about 40 hours. So 20 of those hours have to be with your instructor, and 10 of them have to be solo, and the other 10 can be either can be with your instructor or solo, depends on what your flight school does. So the easiest way to memorize this information is to break it down categorically. So you'll see that I've got with instructor and solo time broken into two different parts. If you break it down like this, it becomes much easier to put in your head. So with your instructor, you're gonna need 3 hours of cross-country training, as well as 3 more hours of cross-country training at night. Notice this is broken off into a little subcategory here. So in your night training, you have to have a cross-country that's at least 100 nautical miles total distance, and at night you gotta have 10 takeoffs and landings to a full stop. And a full stop landing is essentially just a landing where you land and don't take back off like a touch and go. There are some times where we'll come in and land, keep rolling, and touch back off. And if you're already in flight training, you've probably done this. But there are other times where we land and hop off on the taxiway, taxi back to the beginning of the runway, and then take back off again. So these nighttime landings have to be 10 of those full stop landings. Land, taxi back, take back off, start over. 3 of the hours with your instructor have to be simulated instrument time for you. Now, these 3 hours can be mixed in with the others. You can get some of your simulated instrument time while you're getting your cross-country time. And essentially all this is you flying with a pair of goggles that blocks your vision from the window so that you can fly only using your instruments. Most of the time this is broken up into 15 to half an hour chunks by instructors, at least in my experience. As long as it adds up to 3 hours in the end, you'll be all right. All right, and the last one's kind of a weird one. 3 hours previous 2 months. So what I'm saying there is you have to have 3 hours in the preceding 2 months to your check ride. Most of the time, if you're at a flight school, this is already fulfilled because you'll take your check ride or you'll have your check ride date. And that week and the week before, your flight school will assign you some flights. That way you're ready to go for your check ride. So you should already have those 3 preceding flights. What this part of the regulation is trying to get across is if your training is periodic, per se, and you finish all your criteria and then your check ride isn't until 6 months from now, and then you go to take your check ride, once you talk to your DPE, he's going to be looking for some flight training within the preceding 2 months, and you have to have at least 3 hours of it. So if your check ride's far out in the distance, just remember that you're going to have some proficiency flights beforehand to make sure that you're ready to go for that check ride. So then we're on to our solo time. So we need at least 10 hours of solo time. 5 hours of that has got to be cross-country solo. Doesn't all have to be one solo cross-country 5 hours long. It can be multiple solo cross-countries that add up to at least 5 hours. One of those cross-countries has to be the long cross-country, as some people call it. And the long cross-country's got to be at least 150 nautical miles total distance. One of the legs has to be 50 nautical mile total distance at least. And we gotta have at least 3 full stop landings at 3 different points. So we can't fly to one point, do a touch and go, fly to the next point, do 2 full stops, and then fly to the next airport. I don't know why you would do that anyway, but just in case you wanted to, the FAA made sure to let you know that you gotta do full stops at each different point. They also made sure to specify here at the end there that we have 3 full stop landings at controlled airports. And you might say, well, hey, we're already getting 3 full stops at our 3 different points, but you may be getting one of your points at an uncontrolled field. So they're saying 3 of these full stop landings have to be at a controlled field as well, including flight in the traffic pattern. I meant to mention this in the beginning, but this is for ASEL or airplane single engine land. So there's different criteria here. You can be 16 to get a glider rating, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about airplane, single engine, land. Not C, not multi-engine, not gliders, balloons, all that stuff. Alright, so like I said, memorize these if you can. If not, make sure you do memorize for sure the regulation number so that you can reference it in your check ride. It's worth mentioning that your check ride is an open book test. You're allowed to reference your notes, you're allowed to reference your textbooks and your FAR aim. But the thing is, there's a difference between quickly referencing something when you might have forgotten a detail or literally reading it out of the book every time you get asked a question. You don't want to use it as a crutch, you just want to use it as a tool when you can't quite remember something, or it's a list. Speaking of lists, I have these other regs laid out a lot smaller because I don't believe that it's important to really memorize them, but you should memorize the regulation number and what they are. That way you can reference them just in case you get asked. So I'll put these on screen briefly and you can pause them if you're wanting to look at them. But we've got 61.105, which is our aeronautical knowledge areas. We've got 61.107, which is our flight proficiency, and we've got 61.110 and 111, which are our exceptions for those of us getting our license in Alaska or Hawaii or other small islands. There are certain rules that I'm not really going to get into in this video that apply to them for night flights and cross countries because of the limitations of their environment. So that was our certification requirements. Next up is our recent flight experience. Alright, so next we've got our recent flight experience, which we're going to include our flight review in because you could very well get asked about that, and it's an important thing to know. So, the regulation for our flight review is 6156. And if you don't know what a flight review is, basically every 24 calendar months, if you are a private pilot and above, you have to get a flight review every 24 calendar months. And that's what this regulation is describing. So the first part of that to remember is exactly what we just said. The next part of it to remember is that it consists of a 1-hour flight and a 1-hour ground. A flight review also must be given to you by a flight instructor. It can't be your buddy with a private pilot license, or even somebody who has a commercial license and is flying jumbo jets but never got their flight instructor license. Depending on that guy's credentials, he might be able to, but just making the point that it's going to have to be a flight instructor or someone designated by the FAA that is allowed to give you a flight review. If you're curious about all who specifically can give you a flight review, you can go to your FAR-AIM and look at 6156. But I'm breaking down the information that you want to for sure have memorized and that you could potentially get asked about. So we're not going to get into super specific details like that in these videos. Next thing worth knowing is that it is not pass or fail. You don't pass a flight review, you don't fail a flight review. Essentially, the instructor just decides whether or not you are satisfactory, and he's going to give you an endorsement saying that you are satisfactory. So I guess in that way you can call that a pass, but it's not the same in the way that you pass or fail a check ride is basically what I'm saying. It's not going to go on your record. If you're an instructor watching this or you plan on becoming an instructor, you can look up something called AC 61-98D or Advisory Circular 6198 Delta. Now, an advisory circular is essentially something that the FAA puts out that's not law, but is essentially a guiding hand for us in aviation. And even though it's not law, it's highly recommended that you do just listen to the procedures laid out in the advisory circular because that's how the FAA wants them done, and that's how you stay out of trouble. So, Advisory Circular 6198 Delta, essentially just laying out the best way to perform a flight review. They've got a set of criteria listed out for you to check off, and then at the end, the last thing you're going to need during a flight review is to get that endorsement. If you don't get the endorsement, then the flight review doesn't even matter. Now, there are a few other things that you can do or have done that will count in place of a flight review. That way you don't have to necessarily get it. And we've got those listed here. The light's kind of ruining it, but I'll read it off for you. So we've got our pilot proficiency check. Unlike a flight review, a pilot proficiency check is a pass or fail event. So if it can be avoidable, might as well do the flight review. Taking a check ride for a different license or rating will also count as a flight review when you pass 24 calendar months from that pass date is your new due date. If you've completed one or more phases of the FAA Pilot Proficiency Program, that can make you eligible to not take a flight review. If you want more details on that, go ahead and look at 6156. If you're a flight instructor, go ahead and look at 61-197 for the renewal of your flight instructor certificate. That also counts as a flight review, but you can take a look at it because you're a flight instructor and you can do that on your own. A sort of caveat is that if you're a student pilot, you don't have to get a flight review if your training is taking more than 24 calendar months. You don't have to get the flight review because you're still in training. Hopefully your training isn't taking that long unless it's by your own accord. And the last thing we've got down here is just says simulator, and that's because a flight review can be done in a simulator under certain conditions. So if you want to do your flight review in a simulator, I would take a look at 6156 and take a look at those conditions, because again, we're keeping it short and simple, easy to memorize. You don't need to memorize all this if you're not taking a simulator. All right, next we got our recent flight experience, the actual title of the subcategory. So 6157, next regulation over. And here you can see in bold, I've got highlighted proficiency versus currency, because that's what's going to get talked about during your check ride. Currency is the law, and proficiency is really up to you. So currency is the part of the regulation that's essentially saying, if you want to carry passengers with you once you have your private pilot license, within the preceding 90 days, you're going to have to do some landings to practice before you're allowed to take those passengers with you. Specifically, you're going to have a certain amount of landings done within the preceding 90 days. And the rules are different for day and night. So for daytime, 3 takeoffs and 3 landings. They don't have to be to a full stop. They can be touch and goes, they can be stop and goes, whatever you want. But there's got to be 3 and within the preceding 90 days. For nighttime, same amount, 3 takeoffs and 3 landings, but they got to be to a full stop, no exception. So these are the bare minimum rules if you want to be able to take passengers with you flying. But let's say you haven't flown in 3 years, and then you go and you get 3 touch and goes during the day, and you say, I want to take my whole family up flying. At that point, yes, you're legally current, but are you proficient? I can tell you, if you haven't flown in that long and that's all you've done to practice, no, you're not proficient. Rust builds up quick for flying. So a few different examples of that same concept. Say you get your license in one set of avionics, maybe a glass cockpit or a 6-pack, and then you go to rent a plane and it's the other version. It's either a 6-pack or glass cockpit, whichever one you didn't train in. At that point, you have the license to fly the plane, but are you proficient with those avionics? Not really. It would be smartest to get with an instructor who's familiar with that plane and at least do a flight in the plane with him so you can get comfortable with those avionics. Same thing with the aircraft itself. Once you get your license for airplane single engine land, say you got it in a Cessna 172 and your buddy's got a Piper Cherokee, technically you're allowed to go fly that Piper Cherokee right now, but do you think you'd be comfortable just hopping in a brand new plane and taking off all by yourself? I know that I wouldn't be personally, at least when I first got my private pilot license. Now that I've accumulated some hours, maybe it'd be a different story, but when you're so fresh, you don't need to be making huge jumps like that on your own. Same thing goes for location and environment. If you're in an unfamiliar airport, or maybe you're in an environment that you're not used to, such as high winds, even though you might be current, maybe you're not proficient in the location or environment. So although this is not law, if you were to get into some sort of incident or accident, the FAA is going to look at the situation and say, did the pilot in command make a good decision here? Did he act accordingly based on his currency and proficiency? Even though it's not law, you're going to be scrutinized as if it is. And at the end of the day, this comes down to safety, so you might as well be both current and proficient if you want to take people up with you anyway, right? That's it for our recent flight experience. Last thing we've got is our record keeping. Alright, so last part we got is our record keeping. So the regulations dive pretty deep into this, at least the beginning part. That being in 6151 in the beginning, where it tells you how to log your flights/grounds. It gets pretty detailed about how you put it into your logbook. We're not going to get into all the details there. Just know that if you need the information on how to log, go to 6151. That regulation also describes other aspects of record keeping, such as if you're requested by the FAA or an NTSB representative or any state, local, or federal law enforcement officer, you must show them your pilot certificate, medical certificate, and your logbook. The point is, if you're asked about records, you have to show them to basically any law enforcement that asks you. This even includes the TSA, by the way. Also included in this is the documents that you want to have on you when you're solo. So when you're solo, you've got to have your government issued photo ID. So that can be a driver's license, it can be a passport, as long as it's government issued and it's a photo ID, it counts. And the others we just mentioned, your student pilot certificate, your medical, and your logbook plus endorsements. There's a couple other regulations worth mentioning, but again, we don't really need to dive into them because you're not really going to get asked about them, and they're not really things that are to be memorized, quote unquote. You really could just hear them once and you'll have it memorized. First one being 6159. You can see here I said don't lie, and that's basically because 6159 is saying don't falsify your logbook records. If you do, you're subject to losing your license. Pretty obvious. Next one, 6160, is more of just a clerical thing. So if you change your address, you've got 30 days to let the FAA know. Same thing as letting the DMV of your estate know and the post office. But that's all there is to it for this video today for the first subcategory of Task A of the ACS. First one's kind of a doozy. There's a decent amount of information to take in. Not all of them are going to be this heavy on the regulations, by the way, and some subcategories just take longer to explain than others. This one's got a decent amount of information that goes with it. But that's going to be it for today's video. If you enjoyed this video or it helped you out a little bit today, guys, please like and subscribe. Hit that notification bell because we're going to be uploading every day, at the very least every other day, every single subcategory of the ACS until we have the entire thing done and we have a true library of every subcategory. So I hope you guys have a good rest of your day, and I'll see you tomorrow.